Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sticking around as we are about to enter the next session, which hopefully is as exciting as the previous sessions, if not more. I would like to welcome our esteemed panelists this afternoon. Mr. Raja Amir from HSBC, Amanah, and also Bapak Romy Buchari, head of Shariah Banking at Maybank in Indonesia. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your experience and your expertise in this sector today. Now, Islamic finance and banking is indeed a segment that's been growing rapidly over the years. And Indonesia, as we know, is the country with the largest Muslim population in the world. And it is also Southeast Asia's biggest economy with an annual GDP growth of 5%. So it is, by any measure, a big market. We all know that, but those are headline numbers. It would be interesting to find out from both of you, if I may ask, what are the potential in the sectors that are going to be central to Islamic finance industry? Where are the growth coming from? Maybe I can start with you, Pak Romy.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Nice to have everyone here and seeing some familiar faces. Just a little bit on a bit of a background of where Islamic or Sharia banking in Indonesia, as we call it here. We are a nation of over 250 million people now, population-wise, majority Muslim. However, the penetration has been quite slow. For the longest time, we were at about 5% penetration. Now we're at about 7%. This is we're talking about in terms of Islamic banking asset. Okay. Having said that, the growth in the Islamic finance sector, especially on the banking side, has been quite tremendous compared to the conventional side. Where conventional, we're running at a clip of about maybe 8 or 9% tops on a yearly basis. On the Islamic side, we've been running at about 14, 15. Some banks have gone into maybe about 20% on an annual CAGR. Albeit, obviously, it's coming from a quite low base. However, the growth is there. The potential, when you're talking about segments, I think all segments are, the world is our oyster from our Islamic banking side. It's just a matter of getting the economic of scale to be really there. At this moment, we are at about 800 trillion, much better as compared to a few years back. But still, like I said, we're still within 7%. The growth is there. So far, a lot of the growth has been driven from the supply side, with the government helping by facilitating a level playing field. What we need next, later on, would be on how do we create that awareness, how to get the demand side to actually start pulling the side. So that's a little bit in the background of where we are in Indonesia.
Mr. Raja Amir, what are your thoughts on this?
Yep. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon to everybody. So just to take a step back in terms of where we are as an industry globally, before we zoom in specifically on Indonesia, and to give you a kind of a context as to how much the Islamic finance industry has grown over the past 60 years or so. So currently, as of 2021, the data provided by the London Stock Exchange Group states that global Islamic finance assets currently stand at about $4.5 trillion. So what is that relative to the global financial industry? It's slightly less than 1%, 0.98 to be exact. Okay, so some people say that's small, some people say that's moderate, some people say that's arguably that's quite a good run, given that you're competing against a 200, 300-year-old financial system. And when we break down this segment of this $4.5 trillion worth of assets, Clearly, the first sector would be Islamic banking assets. These are your core lending, your trade, financing, and so on, which constitutes about 72% of global assets. Secondly is Sukuk at 17%. So Sukuk is, there's a lot of issuances coming out of the GCC. Republic of Indonesia is a frequent issuer in the international capital markets, but predominantly coming out of the GCC because of the situation with the oil before, where they needed to finance the budget deficits. Thirdly is Islamic funds. So these are your AUM, your asset under management, which currently stands at about 5% of the overall industry, and slightly circa just below 1% of the total AUM of the financial system as well. And fourthly is other Islamic financial institutions, which are your crowdfunders, your buy now, pay laters, and so on and so forth, which is standing at 4%, but I must say it's grown substantially over the last decade. And then finally, it's the takaful assets, which stands at about 2% to date. So that's the breakdown in terms of the 5 sectors that Islamic finance is coming from. And within those sectors, while we say Islamic banking, obviously it's growing at a very fast compounded annual growth rate. Within those sectors, there's also a lot of opportunities as well. If I can just briefly touch on which are the countries where this growth is deriving from. So as of December 2022, the top 8 countries of which Islamic finance originated from were from the GCC. Out of these 8 countries, they were predominantly GCC, but Indonesia and Malaysia contributed about 20%, 18% to be exact, with Malaysia standing at number 3 and Indonesia standing at number 7. So Malaysia has about 15% of the market share, global market share. Indonesia has about 3.3%. Out of which the Malaysian banking system is already touching 45% of Islamic assets. And within the Indonesian banking system, we heard it's already touching 7, some data points to 8. So I think, with a slew of incentives which are being done, specifically focusing on Indonesia, the young demographics, we heard, 87% of the population identifies with being Muslim. There is clearly, and 65% of the shares listed on the Jakarta Stock Exchange are Sharia compliant. A young population which is digitally savvy, religiously conscious. I think specifically to Indonesia and Asia Pacific at large, the opportunities are immense.
Okay. And what about industry sector? Are there particular industry sector that you see will drive growth in Islamic financing, for example?
So currently at the moment, how it stands is that 45% of Islamic Bank's balance sheet is extended to the consumer segment. So these are your mortgages, your car loans, personal financing and so on, with the remainder coming from a mixture of treasury and markets as well as the wholesale market. So I believe with the increasing literacy of Islamic finance for consumers, OJK is clearly doing a lot of regulatory push to ensure that the financial literacy of Islamic banking grows up. Currently it's about 9% in Indonesia, relative to the conventional financial literacy, which is about 49%. I think the sector that will grow would be, in line with the economy, would be on the retail sector, and also supported by the wholesale sector, because a lot of these companies need Islamic financing in order for them to qualify as a Sharia stock. So I think, and that will be also coupled with the growth in the Sukuk market, with more issuers raising debt in the international market. And I must say, Soraya, that whenever you issue a Sukuk in the international capital markets, it's always oversubscribed because there's a lot of asset and liabilities from banks chasing these assets. There's just not enough Sukuk going around globally.
So I suppose the potential for growth in the Sukuk issuance is still...
It's still, where we are currently in the global interest rate environment, it's not, the best time to issue. Okay. But in terms of where the trajectory is of the Fed fund rates, it's expected to go back to its heyday of 2021.
Okay. Now, Indonesia is now pushing for sustainable financing, as the country is transitioning into a more renewable energy. The government is very aggressive in pushing for investment in nickel, for example, trying to make Indonesia a hub for electric vehicle manufacturing. How do you see that benefiting, or how can you take advantage of that push? Pak Romy mungkin?
This is a quite new and emerging kind of opportunities that not just Islamic banking is going after. So I think it's not just specific to Islamic banking in terms of opportunities. Many of these industries are infrastructure in nature. So the kind of cash outlay, the kind of support that's needed is quite sizable. So from Islamic banking perspective, we do have a number of Islamic banking players here in Indonesia. They are quite sizable. But many of the other players are still quite small.
I see.
So in terms of capability, many are quite capable to do that, in terms of providing long-term kind of balance sheet support or a system or infrastructure assistance. However, many would be still quite limited, but perhaps I would imagine they would be able to play and support the peripheral kind of industry that would support this main drive and EV and the sustainability side. So I think this is very good in terms of opportunity for Islamic banking because a lot of it is it's a shared kind of value with the Sharia principles. That's one. Secondly, how do we make sure that many of the Islamic banking institutions that we have can actually compete with the conventional banking providers? So that's key to some of the smaller players. The bigger players, yes, we can go toe to toes, but the smaller players will need a bit more support, as well as maybe in Bahasa we could call it keberpihakan, a bit more policy on the government side to help some of the smaller players.
Mr. Raja Amir?
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more. The tenets of Islamic finance are, if not, they're similar to what ESG principles are. In fact, some argue that ESG took the bite out of Islamic finance because Islamic finance already from the get-go had exclusion criteria. You can't invest in tobacco, you can't invest in weaponry companies, and so on. So the exclusion criteria was already there. In fact, there's a lot of the discourse nowadays is regarding how does Islamic finance play a more centralized role, given that ESG seems to have taken the buzz out of it. So, in terms of specifically funding some of these projects we're talking about, we've seen Saudi Arabia, such as the Private Investment Fund. Republic of Indonesia has already issued 3 tranches of green sukuk, followed up by a sustainable sukuk. The government of Malaysia has issued a sustainable sukuk. We've seen sustainability-linked sukuks and various other products, which is naturally fit to not only fund the national development, because the Islamic finance needs to be at the center of what the country intends and aims to do. And it fits generally in line with some of these projects which bring out a better outcome for humanity and society at large.
Okay, that's interesting. Pak Romy, I'm particularly interested in what you said earlier about, Islamic banks being, having small size and things like that. I know the Indonesian Financial Services Authority, known as OJK, is now has issued a regulation trying to push mergers, and by requiring the conventional banks to spin off their Islamic units. With the thinking of perhaps these small units then will merge to, become a bigger institution. What are your thoughts on that? Is consolidation good for the industry? Or what do you think?
I think in general, consolidation is good, especially where we are in Indonesia. Prior to, let's say, 1998 crisis, we had about, 250, over 300 banks. And the government, along with the industry player, has really consolidated quite a bit now. We're about 100 plus. But still, that's pretty high. Yeah? Right. Compared to our neighbors, let's say in Malaysia, how many do we have? Yeah? On top of that, we still have thousands of rural development banks. Yeah? So consolidation is good. The spin-off requirement that OJK has, what the government has, to some aspect goes against kind of the logic of, consolidations, right? So maybe this is the kind of a smaller step first before we take the bigger step. Sort of like forcing maybe the existing players to, one, be more serious about their business in the Islamic side. Secondly, really put investment into this business. And third, obviously, ultimately, a more consolidation that we can look into the Islamic banking industry. Right now, we're seeing banking landscape Islamically here in Indonesia. We have one large player, but not too many other ones that are quite sizable. It's like a football squad or a basketball team, right? Well, I'm showing my age here. You cannot only have Michael Jordan, right? You need the Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman too. Right. So this is what we need in the medium term, or if not sooner, in Indonesia.
Okay. What about?
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree that consolidation is important in the industry. Not least from a capital perspective. You need sufficient capital to be able to absorb risk in a highly competitive environment. So by pooling together different banks, you're able to really achieve that capitalization ratio. I think as Romy mentioned, the one bank which is already dominating 57% of the market, and that since 2021 has already seen a positive effect in the market in terms of the deepening of the market, the kind of products that they're offering. So that's definitely a positive. Another positivity would be the availability of interbank liquidity in the market, which will enable banks to lend and finance one another in times of shortages, which will absorb the shock that could come in a system when money is being pulled out. I think that would allow more of a focus and a targeted approach, and also capitalizing on the reach, because when you merge, you are able to capitalize on the reach of the branch network, which is very important if you want to serve wider society, especially in the rural areas. And lastly, of course, is to enable a bank to compete globally.
Yeah, so size matters.
Size matters, but at the same time, there also needs to be, obviously through regulation and consumer protection and whatnot, there needs to be that balance to also ensure that there is competition. This has actually resulted in competition. The consumer has not been shortchanged in the whole array of things, and it has brought about a benefit to society at large. So obviously there needs to be that check and balance.
Would your bank be interested in acquiring any of these assets once they're spun off, for example?
Yeah, I'll be pleased to chat with anybody outside the hall if they have any assets that they'd like to show us.
Okay. And Romy?
Same answer. Okay.
Okay. Now, this is actually, I think it's in the back of everyone's mind. We always talk about Indonesia's potential, so huge, and yet, as you both mentioned, the proportion of Islamic banking, Islamic finance, to the total banking industry is still very small. It's only about 7%, less than 10%, versus 40% in Malaysia. And Malaysia has, less population than Indonesia. What is it that Malaysia did that we can replicate, or how can we learn from Malaysia, to be able to grow the Islamic banking assets?
So I would say that, definitely the regulatory element has played a substantial role in the growth of Islamic finance in Malaysia. We know Bank Muamalat Indonesia was established in 1991. Tabung Haji was established 20 years prior to that in Malaysia. So there's a need for a concentrated effort by the regulator, which we do see now happening in Indonesia from OJK, to be able to push the industry further. You need that regulatory push. You need that the regulatory environment to be favorable for Islamic banking to grow.
Can you give some examples of those policies specific to Malaysia?
So specific to Malaysia, I would say that number one is the tax treatment has been equalized, which Pak Romy alluded to is already happened already. So if there's a sale and buyback transaction, the respective you don't get double taxed on the sale and buyback. There has been specific incentives, in particular the capital markets. So a quick one would be that in the Malaysian capital markets, you get 90% deduction on second-party opinion providers, who come in and give you the SPO on a transaction, and you get to claim expenses for all the setup costs for the financing program, for example. There was International Currency Business Unit under MIFC, which is Malaysia's Islamic Financial Center, which gives tax-free treatment to banks to position their US dollar books in Malaysia. And it was open to all, not just Malaysian banks, but to all global banks. So with this, that was phase one, really, because if you come back to the regulator now, they'll say enough taxes. We've already come to, a level that we're comfortable. Now it's about really course correction. If we've missed out in the last 20 years, we've already reached 40%. We're about to touch 50%. Now it's really about ensuring that Islamic banking has actually achieved its outcome, which is what we call the Maqasid Sharia. If you look at are the undeserved populations being supported? Are banks using their zakat money to finance and provide grants to undeserved populations? So that's more of the Islamic banking 2.0, which the regulators are also pushing now, given that it's already plateaued. So, we've reached 50%. What's next for Islamic banking, and what more can be done to ensure that it comes back to
retaining its significance?
Retaining its significance, but is market share the only barometer in this game? Or is it, ensuring that Islamic banking truly is for all, and is, it really is not just taking conventional banking and Islamicizing it. You're actually looking at the fundamental core and creating a unique value proposition which will enable you to compete and stand toe-to-toe with conventional banks.
That's really interesting. Now, still looking at Malaysia, I was just looking the other day about the female role in the industry. And apparently, I read, I think, a report from a news agency that of the top 10 female figures in Islamic industry, Islamic finance industry, actually are in Malaysia. Now, how do you see this? The importance of female role in the Islamic banking industry, because obviously, religiously, women in Islam, arguably may not be expected to perform, as much as the male. Where do you see that happening going forward? Will there be more female, positions? Also, Pak Romy, if you could add to that, the situation here in Indonesia, maybe in Maybank as an example, for instance, and also there's a study that says that even though 56% of the target for lending are actually women, but their access to get those loans, Islamic loans, are actually in the smaller size, are actually more difficult. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, it's a bit of a landmine question, so I'll try to navigate it. So I think at the end of the day, it's important to have diversity at the table, be it age, be it gender, be it disabilities or otherwise. So I think it's always important to have different views at the table. I think we've seen a number of Islamic CEOs in the Islamic banking industry become female.
But is there a push from within the industry itself?
I wouldn't say the industry per se, it's more on an organizational basis. So for example, in HSBC, we have a target of senior leaders, to come from the female population. So we actually look at, who's in a management position that we can push up, but obviously it needs to be merit-based. Even in terms of our interview panels, we have to have a balanced interview panels to ensure that it's diverse. So I wouldn't say it's, I would say it's, Malaysia is really quite a diverse and balanced country. I see ministers who are female. We've seen, politicians, police, you name it. But even within the Sharia scholars as well, one of the most eminent Sharia scholars in Malaysia, Prof. Engku Rabiah, she's a female. I have a Sharia member of my Sharia committee who's a legal expert who sits on my Sharia committee as well. But I must say, we did not strategically do that. They got there because of merit, and they have an equal voice at the table.
Okay, thank you. Pak Romy, if you might,
Yeah, I think it's the same. Diversity is quite important for us. But again, the industry is quite nascent. So the talent pool that's available is still limited, right? That's one. But from our perspective, Maybank, let's say for instance, just like what Pak Raja mentioned earlier, our Sharia board committees, a lot of them are women's. A lot of my teams are women, and they actually drive many of our businesses very well. So that's something that we will continue to concentrate on. Also, let's say we have something on terms of, we have Sharia Thought Leaders kind of forum that we do on a regular basis. We always ensure we will have speakers and panelists and participants from our women's audience as well as industry players. So I think it's in general something that we need to strive for. But again, like I said, the talent pool is really need to be
Bigger.
grown bigger and bigger, and it needs to be systemically done. It can't just be done on the whim kind of things.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. That's a wrap up. Again, please give a big round of applause to all our panelists. Thank you very much.